Welcome everybody to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Mueller, Urban Secretary Pollock here. Consistent with Governor Patrick's executive orders around COVID, we are holding this meeting virtually. I'll read these guidelines so everybody can hear. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation if you would like. Please do not mute or unmute yourself. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. You can find this by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom. The presenters will then call on participants and unmute their microphone. If you are on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Rosine Foley via the chat box at rfoley@ctps.org or by calling 857-702-3704. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant, with exceptions, with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Rosine Foley at the MPO staff at rfoley@ctps.org or by calling 857-702-3704. Now, please, Jonathan, can you call the roll, please?
Yes, sir. MassDOT Chair.
Here.
David Mueller. MassDOT Seat 2.
John Bouchard here.
Thank you. Mass DOT Highway Division.
Tom Romano here.
Thank you. MBTA.
Samantha Silverberg here.
Thank you. Massport.
Good morning. This is Laura Gilmore with the Massachusetts Port Authority.
Thank you. MAPC.
Good morning, Eric Barrasso with MAPC.
Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning, Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board present.
Thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins, Advisor Council here.
Thank you. City of Boston, BTD.
Tom Katzis, City of Boston, representing Mayor Walsh. Jonathan,
Yes.
Is my video coming in?
Let's see.
Yes, we can see you, Tom.
Yes, I can see you, Tom. Yes.
Okay, I can't see myself. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
It's always rough when you can't see yourself, Tom.
Well, you start doubting things. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
City of Boston, BPDA.
Hi, Tim Fitzgerald with the DPDA representing Mayor Walsh, City of Boston.
Thank you. At-large City of Everett.
Jay Monty, City of Everett, representing Mayor DeMaria.
Thank you. At-large City of Newton.
David Kozas, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
Thank you. At-large Town of Arlington.
Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, at-large town, representing Select Board Chair John Hurd and MPO area towns.
Thank you. At-large Town of Lexington.
Sheila Page, representing Select Board Chair Douglas Sinte and MPO towns.
Great, thank you. Inner Core Committee, Somerville.
Tom Bent, Somerville, representing Mayor Joe Curtatone in the Inner Core.
Thank you. Magic, Town of Acton.
Austin Zagano, it's Town of Acton, representing Magic Subregion.
Thank you. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Thatcher Keys, City of Framingham, representing Mayor Spicer.
Thank you. North Shore, City of Beverly.
Darlene Nguyen, City of Beverly, representing Mayor Michael Cahill for the North Shore.
Thank you. North Suburban Planning Council, City of Woburn.
Good morning. It's Tina Cassidy representing Woburn Mayor Scott Galvin and MAPC's North Suburban Planning Council.
Thank you. South Shore Committee, Town of Rockland.
Jen Constable, Town of Rockland, representing South Shore Coalition.
Thank you. Swapped, Town of Medway. Okay, and last but not least, Trick, Town of Norwood, NRRC.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the Town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Thank you. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the chair's report. I don't have one today, so then we'll go directly to Executive Director's report. Tegan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So first and foremost, I would like to highlight one of our outreach activities since the last meeting. MPO staff, they presented and hosted a discussion with the Greater Boston chapter of the United Spinal Association, or GBC. And that's a group of staff, peer mentors, and members who support people with spinal cord injuries and disorders. So they host monthly virtual information sessions that cover a range of topics like housing, transportation to help the people that they support. And the last one focused on transportation. So MPO staff was able to talk about the revised tip criteria, the general MPO activities, the role of the Regional Transportation Advisory Council, and also the Coordinated Public Transit Human Services Plan that the MPO staff produced in 2019. Upcoming, we have a few things to mention. One is that tonight I will be on a panel with a number of MassDOT, OPMI, City of Boston, and other representatives for the Massachusetts chapter of the Institute of Transportation Engineers, or MAITE. And it's their annual meeting, and the topic is discussing the future of traffic volumes and transportation in general. And my plan is to talk about what Marty Milkovits actually recently presented to you, the MPO board, related to how we're going to be thinking about doing scenario planning in an uncertain future using new tools like exploratory modeling and other tools at our disposal. And then about a week later, on the 7th, we have an Inner Core Committee, an ICC transportation group meeting. This is where we partnered with MAPC to create a forum for Inner Core Committee municipalities to talk about transportation. We had our first meeting in January, and folks said that they had an interest in continuing it. And the main goals are basically to encourage, coordinated planning and regional visioning, and then make a deeper dive into funding opportunities for transportation projects for this subgroup. So we have scheduled 4 discussions coming up for 20 to 21. The first one is going to be on October 7th. They're all going to be on Wednesdays from 9 to 11 a.m. So after October 7th, it'll be January 13th, April 7th, and July 14th. I don't want you to have to keep track of those dates. They'll be in the minutes, and also you should be receiving, if you're in the Inner Core, communications about this. If you have, please do register for the meeting if you're able to attend. And if you think that you should have received an invitation and you haven't, please reach out to Roisin Foley at rfoley@ctps.org. Or 857-702-3704. Her information is on the slide deck. And I think that I'll just mention then also, and I don't know if MAPC was going to mention this, but I wanted to remind folks that nominations are due for the MPO elections. Nominations are due to MAPC on October 16th. Those are my general updates. For today, we're going to be talking about the major infrastructure follow-up. It's the continued discussion and requested vote at this meeting on whether the major infrastructure projects, as we've been discussing, should be listed in the Lrtp, the long-range plan, and also details on the scoring and programming for Lrtp listed projects. We are also asking for a vote for the board to consider approving the revised tip criteria that we've been discussing over the last number of months with all of you. And Sandy will also be talking about the results of the pilot community connections program, which we conducted this federal fiscal year 2020, and we'll propose a variety of recommendations for the coming funding round and beyond. And I guess at that point I should say happy October 1st in terms of the federal fiscal year changeover. And then the next meeting, two quick things to highlight. One is we should have a number of work scopes for your review, both MPO funded and non-MPO funded. So some of the discrete studies and then some other work that we have ongoing with other partners and agencies. And also, I think the longer bulk of time at the next meeting will be spent with the MBTA, which will present to you on their Forging Ahead initiative. That's what it's been called. And they've been discussing this at the Fiscal Management and Control Board meetings. You may have heard through those meetings that due to the significant drop in transit ridership and the fare revenue as a result, that the T is anticipating a budget gap, a significant budget gap for the next federal fiscal year, which begins July 1, 2021. And so to address this, they're working now on a strategy that's going to combine fiscal controls, service changes, and reallocations of a portion of federal formula funds to preventative maintenance. So the presentation at the next MPO meeting will give you an overview of their approach to the service planning and the capital planning, and also offer an opportunity for you all as board members to ask questions of the MBTA staff that are leading those initiatives. That, Mr. Chair, is all I have.
Thank you, Tegan. Any questions from the members for Tegan?
Mr. Chair, before we move to the next agenda item, I missed our ex officio members during the roll call, so could I call them now, please?
Sure, Jonathan, go ahead.
Okay, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway Administration.
Thank you. Federal Transit Administration. Okay, I believe that calls everyone. Thank you. My apologies, everyone.
No worries, Jonathan. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is public comments. Is there anyone from the public who would like to speak at this time? If so, please raise your hand and we will call on you. Seeing none, if you have a comment during the meeting, please raise your hand and we'll try to get to you. Next item on the agenda is committee chairs reports. Are there any? I didn't think so. So then Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Lynn?
Hi, there's no report from, we didn't have a meeting since our last meeting here. Our next meeting is going to be on the 14th, and we will be wrapping up the tip criteria with the final presentation on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next item is the minutes from August 20th. Can I get a motion in a second? And please state your name for the record. Can you unmute Tina, please?
Yes, good morning. I would make the motion to accept the minutes of the August 2020 MPO meeting.
Thank you.
I will second the motion. Patrick Keyser, Framingham.
Thank you. That motion having been made and seconded, are there any questions, comments, changes, or suggestions? Seeing none, Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller.
Yes.
John Bouchard.
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg.
Yes.
Laura Gilmore.
Yes.
Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane.
Brian Kane, yes.
Thank you. Leonard Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis.
Mute. Yes, Kansas.
Thank you. Jim Fitzgerald.
Yes.
Jay Monty.
Jay Monty, abstain.
Abstained. Okay. David Kozis.
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page.
Yes.
Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz.
Austin Saganowitz, abstain.
Abstain. Thatcher Keyser.
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Nguyen.
Darlene Nguyen votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the tip criteria. Matt Genola.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone, and a happy new federal fiscal year to you all. Today, our goal is to endorse the draft revisions to the TIP project selection criteria. In support of this presentation, there's a collection of tables posted to the MPO meeting calendar under today's date. These tables contain a full draft of the revised TIP criteria. I'll keep my talking points short and sweet today, as we've covered this topic in great detail over the last 13 plus months. Before we go to a vote, I'd like to do just a couple of things. First, I'd like to again thank everyone on MPO staff who supported this project, as this has very much been a team effort over the last year plus. I'd also like to thank this board for your guidance throughout this process. It's been immensely helpful to have your feedback at every step of the way. My hope is that you found this process to be as collaborative and rewarding as we did. Second, I want to reiterate some of the next steps that MPO staff will take to implement the draft criteria. In the coming months, we'll continue to explore new ways to measure project outcomes, and we'll report back to this board as we have more information on this front. We'll also plan on returning to our discussion from last winter on the cost effectiveness of TIP projects, so stay tuned for more on that as well. More immediately, staff will take the draft criteria as presented today and incorporate them into some supporting materials that will explain the new criteria and help facilitate the project selection process for the coming TIP cycle, which officially begins today. These materials will include an updated TIP criteria guidebook, updated project scoring methodologies, revised project proponent questionnaires, and the return of the TIP how-to guide, which we hope will make the TIP process more accessible to those seeking project funding. That's all I have for today. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the chair for questions, comments, and a vote.
Thank you. Are there questions for Matt? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to approve the TIP criteria? Please state your name for the record.
This is Leonard Diggins, Advisory Council, and I would like to make a motion to accept the new TIP criteria.
Thank you, Leonard. Is there a second? Could you unmute Brian, please? Kane?
Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board, eagerly seconds Len's motion.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded, please call the roll, Jonathan.
My apologies. David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins with a happy yes.
Tom Katzis,
Mute. Yes, Jonathan.
thank you. Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page,
Sheila Page, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Saganowitz, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
thank you. Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
And Tom O'Rourke.
Yes.
Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. And just like to say on behalf of the MPO, thank you to Matt and Betsy and everybody else who worked so hard on this. It was a long effort, really well done. Thanks a lot. Next up is the Major Infrastructure Investment Program policies. And McGann.
Okay, let's see if this is working. Good morning, everybody. I'm back today to finish our discussion on the MPO's major infrastructure program policies. So we've been discussing three major issues surrounding this program. First, we discussed and adopted a new definition for the major infrastructure program. Second, we are now discussing the types of projects that we will list in the Long Range Transportation Plan, or the LRTP. And finally, we will discuss the scoring and programming. Second, we will discuss the types of projects we'll list, and then we'll discuss the scoring and the programming of major infrastructure projects that are listed in the LRTP. So the first issue was to adopt a new definition of the major infrastructure program, which was done at the August 20th meeting. That definition is shown here on the slide, and the main reason for the new definition is to identify projects that the MPO would classify in its major infrastructure investment program that was established as part of the LRTP. This will allow MPO members and project proponents to know if the project meets the requirements of the major infrastructure program when a project is submitted for funding. When the project is ready for programming in the TIP, staff will then evaluate and score these projects using the new TIP scoring criteria that were just developed for the major infrastructure projects. In addition, the major infrastructure funding goal of not programming more than 30% of its regional target funds would then be applied toward these types of projects. So again, as a reminder, this slide shows the funding goals that, how the funding goals were impacted with the new definition and looking at projects that are now programmed in the LRTP and TIP. Most of the changes were in the major infrastructure and complete streets programs, with the major infrastructure program percentages decreasing and the complete streets program increasing. The new definition helps the MPO to move closer to the funding goals established in Destination 2040, and is in line with the MPO's policy of continuing an operations and management approach to programming and giving priority to low-cost, non-major infrastructure projects. So the next item, which is still under discussion and consideration by the MPO, is to identify the major infrastructure projects that should be listed in the LRTP. Certain projects are required to be listed based on federal guidance, and then the MPO can decide if there are other projects that it wants to list at its discretion. So to help in this discussion, staff put together a table of projects that are currently programmed in the LRTP and TIP. And that table was posted on today's meeting calendar, and it looks somewhat like this. I know it's small, but hopefully you can take a look at that. So it shows projects in the LRTP and TIP that are required to be listed in the LRTP by federal regulation, and projects that can be listed at the MPO's discretion. So the first three categories are those projects that must be listed in the LRTP because of federal regulations. The first in dark blue are projects that change the capacity of the network. The second in light blue are projects that change the capacity of the network and meet the MPO's new major infrastructure threshold cost or roadway classification criteria. And then the projects in gray are those that use federal transportation discretionary grant funds. So categories 4 and 5 are those that can be included in the LRTP at the MPO's discretion. Projects in red do not change network capacity, but they do meet the MPO's major infrastructure cost and roadway classification criteria. And then there's a project in green that does not change the network capacity, but meets the MPO's major infrastructure roadway classification. The last category in purple shows the projects that no longer need to be included in the LRTP based on the new definition or federal regulations. So to summarize, the first three categories must be listed in the LRTP, and you can decide whether you want to list projects that are not required by federal regulations, but are part of the MPO's new definition regarding the $50 million cost threshold, and projects that are located on roadways classified as interstates or principal arterials, other classification. And using the information in this table, if you were only to include the projects that are federally required, then most of the projects that are in the current LRTP would continue to be listed. There are only 3 projects that would be listed based on the MPO's new definition because of cost and roadway classification. Both the Sumner Tunnel Reconstruction Project and the Natick Route 27 project would be listed for its cost and roadway classification. And the I-495 Route 1A project in Rentham, which has never been included in the plan, would be included now because of its location on an interstate highway. So if you decided to only list projects based on federal requirements, you would not discuss the higher cost projects or projects that are on roadways that serve regional transportation needs as part of LRTP development. You would be giving up the additional scrutiny for these types of projects during the LRTP process. And these projects would first be considered for funding as part of the TIP development, which is a major change for the MPO. So now I'll get into staff's scoring and programming recommendations for the major infrastructure program that are also under consideration and discussion by the MPO. So I went through this information at the September 3rd meeting, but we'll summarize it again. The scoring and programming policies that are under consideration will be applied to all of the projects that will be listed in the LRTP. So staff offered the recommendations on scoring major infrastructure projects that are shown here on the slide. First, all projects being considered for the LRTP would continue to be evaluated on how well they address the MPO goals established in the plan. Using the same LRTP criteria, each project will be assigned an LRTP score regardless of its design status. And then any major infrastructure projects that have advanced to approximately the 25% design phase will also get a TIP score using the new TIP criteria. So this will provide a comparable set of scores for all LRTP projects, plus extra TIP scores for those that have advanced in their design. In addition, staff recommends that the MPO adopt a formal policy of rescoring all major infrastructure projects when they are ready for programming in the TIP, and it should not be assumed that the project will automatically be programmed. Once the TIP scoring has been completed, the project can then be compared to other projects within the major infrastructure program and other investment programs. And then the MPO can review the funding goal policies adopted in the LRTP to ensure that the projects in the TIP are addressing the MPO's goals and objectives. So for programming projects in the LRTP, staff also recommended that the MPO adopt a policy that the status of all major infrastructure projects included in the current LRTP will be reviewed during the development of a new LRTP to ensure that projects are moving forward in their design and approval process. If there is no movement in design or approval or a schedule for implementation is not available, MPO should consider placing the project back in the universal projects list for consideration in future LRTPs. This will stop the process of moving projects to later time bands if the project won't be ready in its currently programmed time band because the project is either stalled or design hasn't been moving forward. Pushing projects to later time bands crowds out new projects that may be seeking funding that have been recommended in new planning studies or projects that are currently under design. So I'm going to open it up for questions and discussion. I have 3 slides which summarize each of the actions we are asking for you to vote on today. First, as shown here, is to identify projects to list in the LRTP. Next, to revisit major infrastructure scoring, and then third, to revisit major infrastructure programming in the LRTP. So the first action shown here is to identify major infrastructure projects to be listed in the LRTP, and I'm going to turn it back to the chair for this first discussion, and then we can move to the other 2 items after that. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, comments, discussion? All right, and I'll start. So if I'm reading this right, federal regulations, we all understand that federal regulations require any project that changes network capacity to be separately identified in the LRTP.
Right.
What are projects that use federal transportation grant funds? And why are they required to be separately listed? Project, but like what kind of grant funds are we talking about? We don't list ferry boat grants separately in the TIP, in the LRTP. So what kind of grant funds are we talking about?
Well, we were asked, I think it was, I can't remember if it was PATH, Sustainable Region, or Charting Progress, to include a federal funding for South Station, the Federal Railroad. So we were asked to, we actually did a plan amendment to include and list that project in the plan. So, and I believe, I'm trying to think if the 495-90 interchange project also had some.
So maybe Ken Miller could help us. Hey, Ken, what's included in this category? I thought these projects had to be in the TIP, but they have to be in the LRTP.
Well, I can't speak for FRA or FTA for that matter, but I think South Station would be in the plan because it's an increase in capacity for the fixed rail system.
Right.
I don't think it has anything to do with funding. I don't. So.
Right, but so on Ann's chart, the one she actually has listed in gray is I-495-90 in Hopkinton Southborough. And presumably, I'm not sure whether that adds capacity or not, but if it doesn't add capacity, I guess that's the question. If a project doesn't add capacity,
doesn't.
Federal Highway Administration still requires it to be in the LRTP.
No, I don't believe so. I'm looking right at the planning regs, which I'm looking at the definition of regionally significant project, which means transportation project that is on a facility that serves regional needs and not or, and would normally be included in the modeling of the transportation network. It's not or, it's and. So one, if it's not on a regionally significant facility, and I'm not sure all of the ones in blue, darker blue, are on regionally significant facilities, and would be normally be modeled. I mean, you have a pretty disaggregate network, so you know that's certainly as compared to maybe other regions. So that's why some of those would be modeled. But yeah, if it doesn't change capacity, it doesn't have to be modeled if it's not on the.
I know that for the South Station, it was design funds at that point, and they asked us to include that in the plan and for an amendment.
Well, that's because the project itself would be regionally significant for air quality, right? And so you can't program funds, whether it's design or construction, on a TIP unless it's in the plan if it's regionally significant.
So basically, if it's just funding on a regionally significant project, you want it listed in the plan.
Well, it has to be in the plan to be on the TIP. So.
But I mean, like 495 doesn't change capacity. It's just an interchange reconfiguration.
Right.
So then that would not have to be listed then.
Again, if it doesn't, well, if it's on a regionally significant and it would normally be modeled, then that's a question of interpretation. Those changes to that interchange may be significant. You're shortening by significant length some of the travel paths of people in that interchange. So that may be capacity. I'm looking at so something like Hartwell Avenue. Is that a huge change in capacity? I don't know that much about it. Or even Mount Auburn Street.
It's changing. They're all changing capacity.
Oh, okay.
So I know for for air quality purposes, interchange reconfiguration, which is what 49590 is exempt. I'm sorry, we have a dog issue out the window, but
Look, I mean, again, it's the, you know, the MPO has some discretion. If you have a big, you know, look, that's a $300 million project, you know, and so I think that would be logical to include in a plan. I mean, that's just a huge investment. You can make a case, one, it's on a regionally significant, part of the network, and it may be changing capacity. Other things, again, some of these other ones in blue, like you know, I know the new Boston Street adds capacity because it's a new link, and some of these others are new links. That's fine, but it's not clear that they're on regional, you know, that has a regional effect. Again, it's a question of interpretation on some of these things.
Right. So what I think is Ann, is it's not projects that use transportation grant funding. I actually think it's projects that are in the NEPA process, because our federal partners frequently say to us, we can't give you a final determination in NEPA till your project's in the plan. So I think this is what the distinction is, Ann. It's not projects that use transportation grant funds. It's projects that are in the federal NEPA process.
okay.
And would use transportation funding of any sort, federal transportation. Now, on the second issue, so I will just, for my purposes, I don't believe that there should be a cost threshold that determines whether people mute. Matt, can you mute people? There's a lot of background noise.
Yep. I
think that a cost threshold should be the determinant of what gets in the plan or not, as a specific reference. But do other people have a, you know, at some point, the goals of today is to vote this thing. Ann has been working on this for a long time. This has taken a really long time. It's not staff's fault. We need to finish this today, much like we finished the tip criteria. So is there any discussion on whether there should be a cost threshold for determining when a project has to be specifically listed in the plan? So I believe Lynn Diggins has his hand up. I'm going to take him first. I see a bunch of hands. Whenever you're ready, Lynn.
Sure. So your question again, your question just now was?
So if you see on this slide, there's a question as to, so we've already defined major infrastructure to include any project over $50 million. That's a definition for how you would sort it into a funding pot of money. The question is, should a project have to be separately listed in the LRTP solely because it costs $50 million? It doesn't change, if it doesn't change capacity, if it's not on the critical network, but it nonetheless costs $50 million, should we be listing it in the LRTP?
Well, I mean, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, initially, I wasn't in favor of a threshold. The way the question is phrased, I can still do without a threshold. As you know, the concern though is that we get a project in and it eats up a lot of the money for any given year, and if it is classified in a way that that kind of doesn't meet our goals fully. I mean, as you know, especially the advisory council wants to see more complete streets projects than smaller projects. And if the project takes up most of the money and there's very little left for these other types of projects, then we see that as less than desirable. I initially had my hand raised though, because I felt that I was ready to vote yes for this. I was ready to vote yes a few weeks ago, and then and came and talked to the advisory council and clarified some things, and we're ready to move forward. We feel that That second session, at the MPO's discretion, we were fine with the threshold and the additional roadway classification, that we felt that it would solve the problem that initially brought this up, which was that projects that were initially categorized as complete street projects, when they went above a certain cost, were then categorized as major infrastructure, and made it seem like the balance was different than what the MPO has set out as its goal. So I know I'm not answering the question that you asked me, but the overall question of whether this is acceptable to myself and the advisory council would be yes. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sheila?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I also support it, support the threshold. The number, I think, is hard to come up with because cost is continuing to increase. So at some point we might have to bump it again. But I do think it will help us plan better going forward, because as Len had said, we don't want projects to come upon us too quickly, or not, that we're ill prepared to fund them, and at the expense of some other good projects. So I very much support this, but I also very much support the policies that go along with this, in that it'll provide more, it'll make the project proponents, the projects that are on the LRTP, be accountable, so that they don't sit back and say we have a slot, because they don't, and that they'll be reevaluated when they hit the tip time band. So I think the threshold along with these policies is a good combination. So thank you very much, Anne, for hanging in there with us, because I think this was not, we kind of bounced around a little bit. So thank you.
Daniel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I think I agree with Sheila and Len, what they were saying. What I wanted to say in response to the question about the threshold was, again, I think I pointed out before, some of this, the purpose of the threshold is partly to provide some level of planning for, Ken Miller was just speaking about the amount of investment, the substantial amount of investment that these projects, that I think when we talked about the threshold and sort of moving the bar on that earlier in the year, we were talking about how projects have gotten more expensive, and that sort of, I guess, what we consider major infrastructure is that the cost of that has sort of changed, which I think is why we landed on 50 million. So I think it's important for these projects of that scale, of that size, to be listed in the plan, so as at least a understanding of how we would finance them over a number of years. So I think that is a really important part of having them in the plan. It's not, for me, it's not necessarily about some of the other aspects of whether it's has to be modeled or the other features of it, but being in the plan, shows that this is a major project that we're committed to, and that we understand that we are going to have to put some substantial financial resources into it. So I support this. I support voting on this now, and thank you very much.
Tom Katzis?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Folks, you bear with me. I'm trying to clarify some things in my mind, and Mr. Chair, you can maybe help in some ways. So first of all, when we went into this discussion, I wasn't aware, or at least I probably should have been aware, but I wasn't aware that the cost threshold was eligible to be, do we even need a cost threshold? Because I think that's a good conversation. What we found is that we have a cost threshold for a relatively low amount that caused us problems in programming. It was difficult to get around. If there's a discussion that we don't need a cost threshold, I think we should talk about that some more, because I'm just asking, would we be changing 20 million for 50 million? And I hear what people are saying about having some sort of threshold. So, well, I'm just not too sure, to tell you the truth. It's sort of a different argument. I wasn't really aware in my mind that we could eliminate the cost threshold. In my mind, over 10 years of this, ever since it was put in there by the feds, it's been something we have to work around. Mr. Chair, could I ask you for a discussion about, you had mentioned, I'd be very much interested, I respect your opinion, I'd be very much interested in your thoughts on the threshold, which you implied at the beginning of this.
Right, so I'll answer two questions here, Tom. The first is the feds have made it clear to us that it is our rules that require a cost threshold, not theirs. They don't require projects of over a certain dollar amount to be separately listed in an LRTP. Now, I've been around a long time. I remember when they did require it through their guidance, but they don't require it anymore. For my purposes, I think having a cost threshold does two things. First, I think it perversely actually provides less scrutiny, not more. Because I think when we're developing an LRTP, we're working in 5-year time bands, and there's a $50 million project, and it's oftentimes, it's easy to have a $50 million gap and just fill the hole. And then when it comes to tip development, 2 years, 3 years down the road, people say, well, now you have to program this, you put it in your LRTP, you have to keep your commitment. I think that the tip is a perfect place to look at projects and say, okay, that's a $50 million project. That's going to take a significant amount of money over the next 2 years, 3 years. We need to have a significant tip discussion. I don't think the LRTP is a place to program projects except specifically when required by the federal government.
Thanks for sharing that, Mr. Chair. And I just like to, I think that resonates with me. It resonates with me because if we have an opportunity, we've had this cost threshold thing that the MPO has been dancing around, and what the chair is mentioning, I think it's worthwhile giving it a thought, but that's my comment on that. There's one other thing, Mr. Chair, I'd just say generally that, so I have no problems voting, like there's a couple of projects in here right now that don't have MPO funding, okay? And if we're asking to include these projects in the LRTP, if they're not in the LRTP now, I apologize, but to me, it's much more than I know that the change of the definition has consequences, but the week after we change the definition, or the meeting after we change the definition to be including projects that we haven't reviewed the criteria.
We're not doing
Am I missing something?
Yeah, Ann's table is not changing the LRTP. It's just showing you if we adopt these definitions, these projects would have to go into the LRTP. As an example, right? Ann's got in pink the Sumner Street work. If we adopt this definition, we have to amend the LRTP to include Summer Street in, unless it's already advertised and started before the process, right? This is a process that says if a project costs more than a certain amount of money, it has to be in your LRTP in order to be in your tip. So there are, I think, has identified 2 projects that are possibly already in the tip that would have to be amended into the LRTP if this definition passes.
So can I just say one thing? We've already voted on the definition, and that definition is used for us when we're just looking at projects in the major infrastructure program, and just kind of so that we can classify them as part of the, the funding goals.
Right.
So this discussion, it's not to change the definition, it's just to decide what we're going to list in the plan.
Right, but yes, I understand that. But I think the chart, which I find very helpful, has caused a little bit of confusion. And my reading of this chart is the 2 projects in pink. If we have this discussion today and we vote this to include a cost threshold, Those two projects in pink, which have never been required to be listed in the LRTP, will now be required to be listed in the LRTP for the sole reason that they exceed $50 million.
Well,
They've already been in
no,
the
they were in the Sumner Tunnel and the Natick actually have been included
Right, because
before
they keep
because
25.
of the cost thresholds that
Okay.
were required before. It's really the Rentham project that would then be amended back in.
Thank you. And then, but that's not because of the cost threshold. That's because of it's on the
Interstate.
interstate.
So and Mr. Chair, I'll thank you. Can I just say one other thing?
Please, Tom.
So just for my 20 years or however long, so what happened is my take on it was the federal government was concerned about the Boston MPO with the central artery and everything. And they said, let's put a break on how we spend things. And they already have a major infrastructure project. Let's not go too far. What the chair's mentioned about, so what's happened since then, and Len and other folks, I hear what you're saying, but what in fact has happened with it's probably unintentional with these major infrastructure things is it ends up becoming a placeholder where, Jesus, and it's easy to be a placeholder because it's a long-term plan and it's easy to put out there. But there is some logic to addressing this more in the tip with the kind of criteria that Matt and that we've approved and what we're trying to do that our partner from the federal government, Ken Miller, has been talking about with big projects is to take a look at those. Well, what I've seen with the LRTP with major infrastructure projects is I don't know if they ever get, I can't remember when they ever get evaluated like a TIP project. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I've taken a lot of time on that.
No worries, Tom.
Thank you, Ann, for everything with this. It's the implications are hitting home on what seemed relatively benign, and now it's like a core. Thank you.
David Kozis?
Okay, so I'm fine with continuing to include a cost threshold or to increase it if that's what the majority wants. But Anne or David, can someone remind us again, why are we deciding to add roadway classification, even if it does not change network capacity? I just still think that it might, for certain projects, limit us in the future if there's projects that will now be required to be listed in the plan where they weren't required under the old criteria. You know, just because it happens to be within a certain roadway classification, even if it doesn't add capacity or even if it doesn't meet any type of cost threshold. So that's my question.
Ann, you want to handle this one?
All right, so we had this discussion, I don't remember which meeting. It was, it was like in the summer, where we wanted to figure out what a regionally significant project was. And so if you go back to the memo, there's a lot of different things you can look at, and we brought out a lot of information, you know, to you, and roadway classification seemed to be, you know, one of the characteristics that could lead to what we think is a regionally significant project, because there's regional travel on these roadways. So therefore being a regionally significant project. So we voted that out in August. So we voted the definition of what we wanted for a, you know, the major infrastructure project, with two things. One, the cost threshold, which we voted at 50 million, and then the other was roadway classification, because these are roadways. The interstates, the principal arterials are roadways that are there for regional travel. So that was voted out at the August 20th meeting, and that definition is purely used so that we can classify a project in a major infrastructure program and apply major infrastructure program criteria towards that, and to look at our funding goals for major infrastructure projects that are also part of the plan. And that's how that definition is now applied. And that was voted out on August 20th. This discussion is, now that we have these regionally significant projects, it's purely what do we want to list in the LRTP? We have to list, projects that are required by federal regulation, which does not include a cost threshold now. The question is, do we want to now list projects that are over 50 million? And do we want to list projects on interstates and arterials, whatever? You can do one or the other or neither or both, so this is purely, the definition was, voted on. And this is what do we want to list as part of the LRTP?
Right. I mean, I remember that we voted on it, and I remember voting against it. And, I know we can't really change that vote now. I just still think, it would put some projects at a disadvantage in the future, possibly.
Right. So, Ann, the 4 projects in purple on your matrix, they are projects that are in the major infrastructure roadway classification that don't exceed $50 million. But if we adopt this item today, will have to be included in the RTP, to David's point, because they're on a particular classification of roadway. Yes?
No, the purple you said?
Yeah.
Purple are out. Purple are ones that were included before because they met the $20 million threshold. Now we have the new threshold of 50, so they're not on a.
But you haven't done any analysis of the tip that gets to David's point then. What projects would have to be included in the LRTP because they're on a principal arterial, right?
That would be the Rentham project.
That's the only project in the LRTP on a principal arterial?
Yep.
What about?
Or in the tip. It's in the tip now, but it's not in the plan.
And what about the interstate maintenance projects in the tip?
This is capital projects.
So is that, this is only target funds, is that right?
Yes, this is the regional target funds.
Okay. So the only project this would ultimately affect as of today would be Rentham.
Correct.
And then if Lynn actually goes over 50, Lynn would have to go back in the LRTP. Because Lynn's at 44 million with pre 25%.
Right. Well, Lynn's already in there because it had met the 20 million, so it would just
Yeah, but
stay.
I mean in your future.
Right.
In our future, not yours, that's not fair. In our future, it would go back in if it happened to bump up above 50, it would have to go back in.
Correct.
So there's only one project right now, we're saying, but in the future, there would be, could we imagine that some project would be at some type of disadvantage because it would now be required to be on the plan and would it maybe have more difficulty getting on the plan and then getting in the tip?
So I can imagine it. I can imagine that. Yeah. Yes, I can imagine a future where there's a project on a principal arterial that's because, some of these principal arterial others are not big roads necessarily. So yeah, I could imagine where there'd be a locally sponsored project on the wants to use target funds that's on a principal arterial that's whatever type of project it would be, intersection, complete streets, whatever, but would automatically be classified as major infrastructure because it's on a principal arterial. That's the definition, right, Ann?
Correct. Principal arterial other. Yeah.
Yeah. That map that you showed earlier, that one of the earlier meetings. If it's on that map, it's in this category.
Right. Correct. And as I said, you could do the cost threshold and not the roadway classification, or both, or neither. But then it would just be those required by federal regulation.
Okay. Daniel?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I put up my hand because I think when we're talking about, I believe when we were talking about principal arterials and whether or not they would be included, I believe this is something I asked at the last, or actually maybe in the minutes from the August 20th meeting. I believe I asked a clarifying question that these would be on partial or full controlled access. I don't think when we're talking about the principal arterials or other principal arterials that it wouldn't include every single one, but they would have to be on partial or complete access control. So just to clarify, if Anne, if that's correct, you can.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Ken?
Thank you, David. I think, well, one point about just the functional classification of principal arterials. That is not a perfect system because there are quotas for the number of miles of roads that can be put into each system statewide. And so that means sometimes you have inconsistent definitions of whether it's principal, other than the interstate system. But for some of the others, there are some inconsistent definitions for different roads to some extent. But be that as it may, I think the major source of some of the I'll just say the confusion, for lack of a better word, is that you're trying to equate major infrastructure to regionally significant, and that is not necessarily, they're not necessarily the same thing. And I think that the part of the issue also is, and at the risk of suggesting going backwards a little bit, I think the source of the problem is the fact that you have something called a major infrastructure program in your funding categories. I think it would make much more sense to define project types by the type of project, whether it's an arterial kind of project, whether that's complete streets or something like that, or limited access road like the 195-90 interchange, or adding a ramp or something like that to 128, and having those be your project types, and then you can then decide, have the criteria related to your project types, and then the MPO can decide which of any project type they think is regionally significant, and whether that's a threshold or perhaps not, that will be included in the plan. I think that the issue is you have a major infrastructure, it's this so-called major infrastructure category, which is not related to a project type per se. And so I think that, and then you're trying to relate that to also to then regionally significant. So I think I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but I think that may be the problem. Thank you.
So the whole reason that we came up with these investment programs was to really come up with our goals for funding. So you know, we did the scenario planning as part of charting progress. You know, basically the MPO decided they really want to put most of their funding towards these lower cost operation and maintenance type projects, and they wanted to limit the amount of funding towards these larger projects. So, and it's true, major infrastructure doesn't necessarily equate to regionally significant, but that's how the whole investment programs came about. And it really was related to the funding goals. And as I said, that's what this definition is based, you know, we adopted and based, and that's the funding goals will be applied to that. So it's now like, what do we need to list in the plan? And as David said, we need to list those that, you know, are regionally significant under the air quality regulations. And those are projects that change the network capacity, but as you said, on regionally significant type projects. So it is confusing.
Let me ask you just one last question, and then we'll move on to your next part of your agenda. The Lynn project, Western Avenue, it's $44 million. So under the new definition, it's not major infrastructure. It's a complete streets.
Correct.
It will be judged in the tip as a complete streets project. If it ever, because of cost increases on a project, if it ever tips the balance over 450, let's say for argument's sake, it doesn't get in the tip, but then the next year it tips the balance and it's over 50. It's now not competing against it. It's not competing against complete streets. It's competing against major infrastructure projects.
For the funding goal?
Yeah. Yeah. For the tip criteria too. You got different tip criteria, right?
Right, and I believe, and Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it will be scored as a complete street project. And then if there's some other ones that apply in the major infrastructure criteria, then that will also apply.
Yeah, now I'm confused. It's either, it can't be two. It's one or the other.
Right. So,
Okay.
so maybe Matt can, I know
Yeah.
we talked about this, Matt might be able to.
Yeah, somebody help me because now I don't understand.
Yeah, thanks. So it would be scored as a major infrastructure project, but what we've done with the new TIP criteria is created sort of a funneling process within the major infrastructure criteria to cater to whether it's a corridor project, an intersection or interchange project, or a transit project. So it'd still be competing for dollars and effectively on points relative to the other, points in the TIP score relative to the other major infrastructure projects. But the criteria applied to it are a little bit more catered to it being a corridor rather than an interchange, let's say. But it would still compete directly with major infrastructure projects and not with complete streets projects.
Okay.
Thank
you. So we do have a situation then, where if a project like this project again doesn't get funded as a complete streets, because theoretically because it costs too much money, and then it manages to cost more money, it can be funded as a major infrastructure. Okay. Lynn?
I'm sorry, David. Eric has actually had his hand up for a little bit.
I don't see his hand. Eric, sorry.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I too, I guess, and I apologize, I was under the impression that we did have to include projects based on some cost amount, although my understanding was we had more flexibility to decide what that is. So I guess I didn't realize that was something we don't necessarily have to include projects in the plan because of cost. David, I just wanted to understand your comment you made a little earlier, which was you felt that, let me see if I get this right, that because if there's a cost threshold, when we do the plan, that we end up making like capital decisions that are, years, sometimes even decades away because the project it's time now for that project to be able to be in the plan. So people bring those projects forward, and there's this tendency to want to then make decisions because it's more than a certain dollar amount. Is that the point you were making about why you feel like that's not so great if there's a cost threshold?
Yeah, so here's the point here's the point I would make. I think, so as an example, if you come as a project proponent and say you don't want your project in the first 5 years, you want it in the second 5 years, and it has to get in there because of a certain dollar figure. Because we deal in 5-year time bands, and because it's so far distant in time at the time we program it, we don't give it the level of analysis that we get to TIP projects. But you get yours slotted, and then slowly we get there, and now we feel like we've made a commitment and we have to keep it. Again, I think
I agree with that.
We'll take the Lynn project as an example. I think if Lynn came to us and said at TIP programming, we want $44 million for a complete streets, we would give it a different analysis than we gave it when they came and said, we're not asking for TIP programming. We just like to get in the plan because we have to be in the plan before we can get in the TIP. We put them in the plan. Now I think they have every right to expect us to keep that promise.
Right.
But I think we make those promises too easily, and the $50 million threshold just makes it, I think, easy to slot somebody in and then have them say, wait a minute, you can't break your promise.
So I agree with that. And I don't know if there's a way to address that. I guess where the conflict I have is I feel like, I agree with you that the plan is not the right place to be making, long range, detailed capital decisions. I think we've moved to the point where we're making now more programmatic decisions in the plan, and I think that's the right place for it. So I agree with that point about not the TIP discussion should be where we evaluate those projects. But I feel like as a document for the public to see what are the major things that are happening in the region, that it does make sense to have those in the plan. So I don't know if there's a way to address that. But I agree with your point, David. I wanted to say that.
Lynn?
Yeah, honey.
Thank you. So between the time I raised my hand and now, it's just so much has passed. I will say that I wasn't expecting Matt's answer because I was under the impression that if a project was scored as a complete streets project, and then it crossed a threshold cost amount, that it would still be considered. We scored as a complete streets project. It's just that now, because of the cost, it's now put in a category of major infrastructure, meaning that when we look at how we spend money across various our goals, we would then say, well, we're spending $50 million on major infrastructure, whereas it initially started off as complete streets, and that was why we did this whole thing in the first place, because we had projects that were crossing over the lower threshold, which I think was $20 million. So there's that. I will say that I support the programs, or if I were to, I support this process, meaning the programs that Anne has listed, mainly not so much because of the programs that are in the LRTP, but because of those that fall out, because that was the goal of this overall of this process initially. And finally, to Ken's point, if I could sum up his point as to it isn't so much what the project is called, but what it does. I'm totally in favor of that. And I think when it comes to evaluating our goals for the MPO, that we think about how we can do that when we start discussing what our goals will be for the next cycle. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. Any other questions or comments on this set of issues before Anne puts up her next slide? Because I think there's a second set of issues we have to talk about before we take some vote on this, right, Anne?
Yep.
All right. Go ahead, Anne.
Okay, so scoring. So once you decide which projects you're actually going to list in the LRTP, and this will only apply to those that are listed in the LRTP, we want, this policy of which we already do. We assign an LRTP score to every project, regardless of its design status. And then, they're much broader because a lot of these projects may not have the detailed design, so the criteria isn't as detailed in the plan process, because some of these are at the conceptual stage. And then any project that does have 25% design, will also provide the tip score. And then, as we've been talking about, once a project's in the plan, most people assume that it's going to get programmed in the tip, no matter what. But so what we're asking is that there's not the assumption that it will automatically be programmed in the tip. When it comes into the tip process, the project will be reprogrammed or rescored with this new criteria, because some of these projects, as I said, were conceptual, so you want to apply. There may be a design may have changed. You will have gone through the public review process. There could have been public comments, which would then cause the project to be changed, the design changed. So you want to then automatically, and as Tom said, sometimes we don't even rescore these projects when they come into the tip. It's just assume that they're going to be programmed. So that's the next item. That's the scoring.
Okay. Questions, comments? Seeing none.
I've got a comment from Brian Kane.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks. I guess the question is, if this does not pass today, then what's next?
Anne?
I guess I'd wait for your direction to see why it's not going to pass and to see if there's other information. And then I guess we would just go on as we have in the past. We'd score. And then when it came time for a project to be programmed in the tip, it would be up to you whether you want to rescore it with the new tip criteria and just either assume or not assume that it's going to be automatically programmed in the tip, which is kind of what we've been doing all along. It's just, this is really making the decision that you are going to rescore that process, and it's going to have to be compared to, you know, other projects in the same category, and what, you know, what at that point in time the MPO is looking for the types of projects.
Okay, thanks.
So, Ann, when you say other projects in the same category, it will be scored as a major infrastructure project compared to other major infrastructure projects. And given that they probably don't all advance at the same time, aren't you just scoring it against itself? like isn't there likely to be a place where there's only one because we can only afford one at a time? Like we told McGrath, we'll get to you next year maybe, or whatever we told them. You know, isn't it likely there's going to be one score, and it's just, you could theoretically compare it against everything else, but
Well, right, but there may be, you know, like this year, and I'm trying to remember, it was Somerville and Natick. And there may have been another one that I can't remember. So it's like really deciding which one you think is best to go forward. And at that point in time, you know, and this is what performance-based planning is about, you know, do we want to do a project that's going to provide more bikes and sidewalks, or do we want a project that's going to improve an interchange?
all right, cool. Jay?
So I'm becoming more and more appreciative of this sort of nuance here. And I think you give a good example of Lynn, and honestly, Everett would have fallen into this with Berry Street had we not even moved the needle up to 50 million. You know, but I'm cautious about, you know, I mean, I think these projects should be scored, the major infrastructure projects should be scored, you know, rigorously. But one big differentiator between what we typically have as a major infrastructure project and as a, you know, say complete streets project is that, you know, major infrastructure tends to be, the design and project development tends to be funded by MassDOT, not by the community. So, you know, I think if we get into this process where we're taking, say, a Western Ave that's, you know, 50 million, and we assume that Lynn's gonna have to put, you know, $5 or even maybe more than that $1 million into project development. I think they do need some assurance that it will be programmed, which I think is not to say that we should be coming at the last minute and then scoring it. I think maybe we got to be scoring these major infrastructure projects much or at least rigorously scoring them much sooner. And to David, your point, I mean, they should be compared against each other, not, you know, if we're looking at 5 projects over a 25-year time band, maybe we ought to be scoring the 5 of them as a group, or some process like that. I worry that we're going to take a project that a city or town has put a lot of money into developing, only to say at the last minute, oh, you've fallen into major infrastructure territory now. We've got to think about it again, and you've already, you know, put out $5 or $6 million to design it.
But isn't that what's happening kind of with tip projects as well?
I think with tip projects, we don't put out much to get it, you know, scored on the tip, right? We take it to a conceptual, you know, PRC approval, right? Which is a low level of design. And then you spend the 3 or 4 years between the time you've been put on the tip and the time you get programmed into doing, you know, the major development. So I think the worry is that, you know, you get put on the tip, you're at PRC, you haven't put a lot of money in, but then you go all out and you start doing project development. As you do project development, the cost goes up, and now you're into major infrastructure. Now you're being asked to be rescored and reconsidered after quite a lot of money has been, you know, put out by the city or town.
And would that then go against the not listing projects with the higher cost threshold in the plan?
Yeah, I think this kind of gets at, you know, Ken's point of maybe this is the wrong, maybe this category is kind of ill-defined in some ways, because we're not defining it as a project type. And I tend to agree with Ken on this, that I think there's a hiccup here with that.
Ken?
Thank you. Just a reminder that all projects that meet whatever, however you choose to, whatever the appropriate criteria are for including a project in the long-range plan would apply to projects not only that are target funded, but because that, whether it's target funded or funded on the state side, that's sort of a construct that's not really relevant to what the kind of project should be included in the plan. So just a question, Ann, was the Charlestown Bridge included as a project in the plan? North Washington State, I should say.
Yeah, there was, normally when it's plan time, we talk with MassDOT and get the list of all projects that are over, the cost threshold, and we list those projects. And it can change from year to year, but at that point, it's generally I'm trying to think if we did it this year, but normally we have our projects, that with regional target funds, and then we have another table that shows bridge projects that are over the cost threshold as well.
Okay.
And it's at that point in time when the plan is adopted.
Okay, because also that, the kinds of projects that should be included in the transportation plan are those kinds of projects that are the product of a regional planning, your MPO planning process. It's not necessarily only projects that are proposed by municipalities or, so, when you do your regional planning, whether it's a corridor study or some other kind of study, those are the kinds of projects that, you want to plan it. It's supposed to be a plan. That's what this thing is, not a list of projects. And it should be the result of a planning process where you actually think about, well, what are the kinds of things that as an MPO we want to get accomplished in the region.
Right, and we have other, the list includes other like state funded projects as well. It's not just the regional target, but for our funding goal of not more than 30%, those are where we apply it to the regional target funds. So like I said, it's two things. We have major infrastructure program definition that's for, our scoring criteria and for our funding goals. And then there's the projects that we're actually going to list in the plan, which we have that whole list in our universe of projects, are all the projects that we can consider for regional target funds and those that the state's funding. And
right. So Ann, Ken has confused me. And so now let me ask you a question. I think our position is that for the LRTP, our major infrastructure definition applies only to target projects. And we won't be listing bridges that are over 50 million. And we won't be listing IM projects that are over 50, that are however much they cost because they just happen to be on the interstate. The major infrastructure category is a MPO target funded category. Is that right?
yes.
Thank you, Ann.
Yes.
Sorry, Ken, I didn't hear you. I didn't hear you. What you say, Ken?
Yes, I'm sorry. And I wasn't suggesting otherwise, David. I was just asking the question whether to point out for a long-range plan that, it should include the kinds of projects that should be included in the plan, regardless of the funding. I wasn't suggesting that the North Washington Street Bridge would be included if it's just a replacement or something like that.
That's part of our universe of projects list. So that's how the whole thing starts. So then the MPO can look at all of these projects.
Okay.
I'm sorry, David. Tom has had his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can't. For some reason, I'm not seeing them all, Matt. So thanks.
No
Tom?
worries.
No, thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just relative to my, earlier comment, this major infrastructure revisiting, I like what I see here. It sort of addresses some of the just comments that I made. How practical, Ann, is it to this 25% design. So we go in bands of 5 years. Is it too complicated to expect some sort of design status out of a project? If they're 7 years out or 8 years out, that you'd expect a 25% design by 5 years. I don't know if that's too complicated. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's one question I have about this. And then just the other comment that this is sort of an attempt to get at what I was talking about earlier. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks. And Ann, I don't know what you think about that.
So the 25% design, I care, Tom. The 25% design is basically what we say, you know, for a tip about us when we score.
No, I agree.
That's the functional design report. But there are some projects. There are some projects that aren't going to, like, obviously the first 5-year time band is the tip that is there now.
Right.
There are some projects that aren't in that tip that are waiting in line that very well could have been scored. So they'll get the tip score. Further out, those are the conceptual projects that, you know.
What I'm getting at is further out, can we have some rule where a conceptual project has to deliver a 25% design at some point? At some point, at some point exceed. That's all I'm saying. And
yeah, wait. So that's the next issue, the programming issue. That's the third issue that we talk about.
Well, all right. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Ann.
Jay?
Yeah, so I'm looking through the list, and maybe I'm going to ask this question, but I thought of mine was that a lot of the projects that we put into the long-range plan, these larger projects, they are initiated by a state agency, whether it be MassDOT, the T, and I think that's a major differentiator. We certainly have projects on the major infrastructure category that are, you know, city initiated, but you know, I guess, David, to your point that, you know, these are target funds, not, you know, statewide funds, but that ownership of the project seems to have some place here, and I'm kind of struggling with where that plays in if we change you know, the thresholds or the process for major infrastructure, because it seems like whether it's the Green Line extension, McGrath, 495, these are all big. These are the projects that you would say are the regionally significant projects. You know, to Ken's point, these you know, fit, I think, the textbook definition of what major infrastructure is. And okay, the target funds, but they're also really projects are being developed by the state, not by municipalities. That to me is a big differentiator and something that somehow should factor into this. And I'm just throwing that thought out there. If anybody wants to bite on it, you're welcome to, or not.
Thank you, Jay. Other comments, questions, concerns on this part of the slide? All right, then go to you got a third slide?
Yeah.
For discussion?
Let's see if it's working here. So this is for the programming. So whatever projects we decide that we're going to list in the plan, whatever they may be, when we're whatever's in the current plan, when it's time to develop the next plan, we want to look at each of those projects to make sure that they are moving forward, much to like what Tom said. Are they moving toward design? Is there any public review or outreach or whatever going forward with the project? And if there's no movement at all and we just keep pushing the project, if it's, you know, out to a later time band, then you may want to develop a policy that if there is no movement in that toward to design or approval, or if there's no schedule for implementation, then you may want to place that project back in the universe of projects list, you know, not get rid of it forever, but for consideration in future LRTPs. And that's so that, you know, we do this every 4 years. There may be new studies that with new recommendations, or there may be new projects that are actually under design that you may want to reconsider as bringing into the plan, because sometimes you just move these projects further out and they're taking up a big chunk of your funding, and then you're not even looking at these other new projects. You have, in the last two plans, left open like the later time bands and not programmed anything for that reason. So this is just a policy that we're asking you to consider. And that's the last policy for now.
So, Ed, let me ask you, so refresh my memory. How far out, at least in the current LRTP, how far out do we program major infrastructure? Is it the first two bands?
In charting progress, it was the first.
So now I can hear you. Now you got to look at your microphone for me to hear you.
Sorry.
That's okay.
So we do have a project programmed in the Framingham project in the 2035 to 40. So basically you have 2020 to 24, you have it funded through 29, and then in the third time band, you have the Framingham project and the Lexington project and finishing up with the McGrath. And then in the last time band, you're finishing up with Framingham.
Right, and so is this recommendation apply to all of the projects? So would we go to, and again, I'll just use Framingham because they're the farthest out. Would we go to Framingham in the next LRTP and say, show us you've made progress on a project that we don't expect to fund for 15 years? And if you haven't, we're going to throw you in the universe of projects?
It could be. I mean, that project actually is one that has been in and it keeps getting pushed out. So, I mean, it's like if there's absolutely no progress, you know, I mean, are they doing public, you know, I mean, projects in 15 years, a project in 15 years could not be a priority anymore.
Okay.
So, I mean, basically, if you remember for this, what we did this time was we had our universe of projects, and then staff put together like a cheat sheet for each one that talked about the descriptions, you know, how it met the goals, and then, you know, where it was in its status and what has been happening. And then we had the proponents come in and talk to you and say, you know, first we had those that were programmed in the TIP, then we had those that are programmed in the plan. And they came in and talked to you about what was happening with the project and what was, you know, was anything happening? Is it moving forward? And then we brought in proponents that weren't included in the plan, but wanted to be included in the plan and find out what their status was. And I would assume we would do the same process so that would allow you to know are these projects moving forward, or are we just going to keep pushing them?
Okay. Questions or comments?
We've got Len.
Thank you, Matt.
Yep.
And Matt, can you just call on people so I don't?
Yeah, absolutely. Not a problem.
All right, Lynn?
So I'd like to thank Ann for spending, you know, about a half hour yesterday with me discussing the overall process, so that I can say that I fully support this. And yes, in the case of a project that keeps getting pushed back into the 15-year or that third time band, I mean, then it's really making no progress. I mean, it's just staying in there because nothing's happening. So it's looking like it's in the third-year ban. I understand your concern, Mr. Chair. That is that would a project get penalized before saying, well, I mean, we're ready to go in the third time ban, and we really wouldn't maybe expect them to do anything until they got closer in. But if they get closer in, and then by default of not doing anything, they get pushed back, then I think we really should consider putting them into the universe and taking them out of the LRTP. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn.
All right, we've got Thatcher.
Yes, thank you. So I came into the meeting very sure of what I thought about this proposal, and I actually, Mr. Chairman, you made me feel a little bit better when you said you were confused, because it made me feel a little better about some of my confusion on this. But I think the Framingham project is a good example of the challenge we face in Framingham, in the sense that, you know, this project, you know, it's in the, is it a case that it's in the third band because nothing was making progress on, you know, leading up to it? Or is it, we're not making progress because it's in the third band, and with all the current financial challenges, you know, it's all about timing. And it was mentioned earlier in this meeting that, you know, and this is, you know, it's an issue for municipalities, even at the smaller project level, of making commitments to doing the preparatory work with, you know, no guarantee that, you know, the project's going to be able to move forward after expending those funds. And the bigger the project, the bigger the risk on this. And I know for Framingham, we decidedly said we are going to start moving forward and making the financial commitments, because this is really important to us. And the fact that, you know, when the project gets moved out, then you start resorting your immediate priorities. So my uncertainty on, you know, with all the discussion boils down to dealing with the timing of us and other municipalities, you know, making our commitment to expend funds to do the, you know, the pre-work, if the certainty of a project moving forward is less certain. So I appreciate the chairman's comments earlier in regard to the question of, if it's on the long-range plan, does that become a commitment? And from my perspective in Framingham, yes, if if we started expending funds in that direction, and significant funds, my answer is at some point, yes. There are factors that come along that cause this MPO to have to, you know, readjust priorities. That's understandable. But at some point, when municipalities are expending funds, the expectation of commitment gets greater and greater as we spend more money and we get closer to the project. So I just wanted to kind of add those comments to my thoughts on the whole conversation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Eric?
So I think including, you know, or better defining these policies around like actually revisiting these projects during the TIP discussion, I think is good. And I think that does address some of the issues that David first brought up, which I do agree with about, you know, we might program a project, or at least we used to, you know, 10, like 15 or 20 years out, which I think is a mistake. And then there's this commitment to it. However, I will say that if we did program a project, I think it would be very challenging to take it off. I think, you know, a community would come forward and they'd say, oh, we held 3 public meetings, or I just think politically it'd be very difficult to kick somebody off something. So I just want to raise that. I think it's still good to have it there to say, like, you know, just be clear, this isn't, you know, this isn't a total commitment. But in general, I think that I think we shouldn't be programming projects way out in general. But I think this policy does help to kind of blunt those issues or address those issues.
Thanks, Eric. Matt, is there anyone else who wants to
No
speak?
further questions.
All right, so now we need a motion, and I think that motion, well, I'm not going to make a motion, so I'll let whoever's wants to make a motion to define their motion so we can all know what we're voting on. Oh, wait, I think Tegan has a question or a comment. Tegan, you have something you want to say?
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Chair, because of the settings, I can't actually functionally raise my hand. So occasionally try to set a chat or something. I don't want to complicate anything, but I thought I might make a suggestion for consideration that I don't think has been discussed yet, which is that the board could also decide that it's comfortable with the idea of listing major infrastructure projects in the earliest time bands and not the later time bands. It's an option if you want there to be some communication about what might be coming in the next 5 to 10 years, but, you know, not necessarily beyond 10 years. I believe the MPO decided to not program the most outer band of the LRTP in terms of projects the last time it was discussed. So I don't think I've heard that idea thrown out there, and I feel like this is the place to throw out everything at the moment.
Thank you, Tegan. Any discussion? Does anybody want to make a motion? And please state with, when you make your motion, if you do, please state it with some specificity so we all know what we're voting on.
And David, do you want to vote all, or do you want to do each one individually?
I actually hadn't thought about that, Ann. I suppose we could take votes individually, but then we have to take a final vote on all of it, so we all know what's in and what's out. If you think it would be easier for people to make individual motions on individual parts, I'm certainly happy to do that. I do want to get to a yes or no finally, so we can move forward from this.
Yes. I don't know what would be easier, because it kind of would be a jumble if you put all three together.
All right, well, is there anyone who would like to make either a large motion or a small motion?
Thatcher?
All right, sorry, I'm fighting with the unmute button. I don't intend to make a motion. I'll let somebody more technically savvy to do that. I just want to piggyback on Tegan's comment that I do like that, because it seems to address my concern that, and I use the Framingham project as an example, that if a project's too far out, it is a real concern to start, allocating current funds, start making those financial commitments too soon, where it's so far out, there's greater uncertainty as to whether it's going to happen. But if it's in an earlier time band and it's a shorter time frame, it gives us more confidence to make those financial commitments, because there's more certainty as to what's going on in that time band. So I don't know what the correct motions would be, but I really appreciated those comments. It makes me feel more comfortable from that concept that was presented of an earlier time band versus all the time bands. So whoever is more technically savvy at figuring out how that should move forward, I'll leave it to them.
Excellent.
Len?
Well, I was going to give the motion a whirl. And my sense, though, is that we can do what Tegan and Tom are proposing under the context being, it would be more of a practice as opposed to changing anything that the staff has recommended that would go into a motion. But at this point, I'm going to pose that as a question to Ann before I make the motion, and then also see Tom up. And so I'm going to hold back and put that question out. Maybe let Tom go if the chair decides he wants to do that. And then if no one else wants to make a motion, I'll give it a stab.
Thanks, Lynn. So first, Tom, before you talk, let's let Ann, Ann or Tegan. I think Lynn's question is, we could either make Tegan's suggestion part of the definition of major infrastructure somehow, or we could just trust each other that that's going to be our practice as we develop the next LRTP, that we'll all remember, hey, remember that discussion, we're not actually going to program projects out in the third or fourth time band. Tegan or Ann? Yeah, Ann, go ahead.
So I take that as the definition would stay the same, but for this item under what we want to list as part of the LRTP, we would list all projects that are required to be listed by federal regulation, and then we would only list projects that, I'm not sure if you want to go with this, but the projects that are over 50 million or on the roadway classification, I'm not sure where the MPO wants to go with this, in the first two time bands of the LRTP. So you only list the major infrastructure projects in time band 1, which is the tip, and then the next time band.
Okay. Excellent. Great answer.
Unmute. Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion. Can I preface it with, this has been helpful to me. I understand. I was trying to come to grips with some of the points you brought up, Mr. Chair. What I'm going to make a motion is on the cost threshold, because it all starts there. And I just suggest that the MPO be open to revisiting this several years down the line, because I'd be comfortable with the cost threshold in the sense that this is how we've been going. And what we had today was more of a radical departure that may make perfect sense. But Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion that the identification of major infrastructure projects to be listed in the LRTP include the cost threshold of $50 million, which is the Boston MPO definition of cost.
Thank you, Tom. Is there a second?
Fetcher?
I will second that.
Discussion. Daniel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to second it, but I guess my question is, were you just voting on this item that's on the screen and not on the second and third items right now? That seems to be the motion.
Yes, so Tom, and so here's my other point of confusion. Tom has made a motion only on the cost threshold. He hasn't made a motion on roadway classification. So that doesn't mean that if this motion passes, roadway classification is dead, but someone would then have to make a motion on roadway classification as part of the definition that would be included in the LRTP.
And it's for all time bands, right?
Yeah, well, presumably someone could then make a motion to say, I'd like to limit the inclusion to, we need to finish this page before we go on to the next page. That being
Okay,
said,
thank you.
there is a motion and a second. Any other discussion? We'll call the roll only on the discrete question of, should there be a $50 million cost threshold for defining major infrastructure projects in the LRTP? The motion is there should be. Call the roll, Jonathan.
Yes, sir. David Moeller,
No.
John Bouchard.
Bouchard has left the meeting, I believe.
Okay. John Romano,
John Romano, no.
Samantha Silverberg,
No.
Laura Gilmore,
No.
Eric Barassa,
I'm also going to vote no on this one, but may change my mind if we include some of those other policies.
okay. Brian Kane,
Kane, no.
Leonard Diggins,
Advisory Council, no. Leonard Diggins, no.
Tom Kazis, somebody unmute Tom.
Thank you. Yes. Tom,
Yes. Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, no.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page,
Lexington, yes.
Tom Bent,
Yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Saganowitz, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, I'm going to abstain.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina has left the meeting.
Oh, she's left the meeting. Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, no.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Jonathan, if I did my math, that fails on a tie vote. But you
Yes,
check.
I have 9, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, tied at 9 of each.
All right, so that's it. That fails. Fails of adoption. Can I get a motion? So, in order to get off this slide, is there a motion to include either roadway classifications, major infrastructure projects listed in the LRTP based on roadway classification, and or to limit the inclusion of major infrastructure projects in the LRTP to the first 2 time bands? I'd like a motion on one or both of those if possible.
Thatcher.
I'll make a motion to limit to the first 2 time bands.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Sheila.
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, can you call the roll, please, Jonathan?
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bashar, he's gone. John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Sorry, can you come back to me?
sure. Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
You're unmuted, Len.
Okay, Diggins, yes. Thank you.
thank you. Tom Kadzis,
Kansas, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page,
Sheila Page, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Benton, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Saganowitz, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Tina Cassidy is left. Jennifer Constable, Jennifer Constable,
Sorry, Jennifer Constable, yes.
thank you. Tom O'Rourke,
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
and I'll go back to Samantha Silverberg.
Sorry, I just voted. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Excellent.
And can I confirm that that's only those that are required to be in by federal regulation?
Yes. So what we've said so far, we may still talk about roadway classification, roadway threshold. Someone might make that motion. But what that motion said was, whatever the major infrastructure definition ends up being, we're only going to include projects in the LRTP for the major infrastructure program in the first 2 time bands. I think that's what I understand it to mean. You too?
I think so. I think it's, but our definition was already voted on. So basically for those items, it's projects required by federal regulations, not cost threshold, because we voted that out, and then it's just a matter of roadway classification, right?
Yep.
Okay.
So is there anyone who wants to make a motion that the major infrastructure projects should be included in the LRTP based on their roadway classification? All right, let's go on to the next items under discussion so we can get a motion on this. All right, so can I get a motion, somebody make a motion on all or part of this? This is about revisiting the projects.
Boring.
Yeah, when they're ready for TIP programming, right? Assuming that LRTP major infrastructure projects will not automatically be assumed to be programmed in the TIP, but they will be scored for inclusion in the TIP. Can I get a motion on this one?
Eric?
I will make that motion, just what David said.
Is there a second?
Sheila?
Can you just repeat the motion? I think I want to second it, but it includes all 3 bullets on the screen.
Yes.
Yes, second it.
Discussion. Is there any discussion on this?
Tom?
I was going to second it, but I'll take the opportunity to start a discussion. Yeah, I think that these are common sense. It's a good stab at trying it. Way to go in. And I think I'd urge the MPO to be flexible and not necessarily paint ourselves in a corner by what we exactly mean by it. Because we found out that there's different ways to skin this cat. I'll second that motion. Oh, it's already been seconded, but I'm going to be approving. I'm going to be voting for the motion.
Thank you,
Thank
Tom.
you.
Jonathan, please go ahead and call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kansas,
Yes, Kansas.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page,
Sheila Page, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Zaganowicz, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And can you put the next slide up? So this is the issue of projects have to continue to make progress in order to be continued to listed in the plan. If they don't make progress, they'll be put back into the universe. Can I get a motion to adopt this slide, this proposal as presented on the slide, please? Or some other proposal?
Brian Kane?
I had a question on the language. What do we mean by progress?
Yeah.
basically what I was thinking is that nothing is happening. So like, as I said, we have people come in and tell us what they've been doing to move the project forward. If there's like public meetings and there's, public support, if there's something happening, if, and to tell you the truth, when we did this and we, as I talked about the cheat sheet that we had, and then we invited the proponents in, all proponents came in and provided information on that these projects were moving forward. So it's, any design, any approvals, any public meetings to talk about the project. If it's absolutely nothing going on, that's what I was thinking.
So it would be progress in the opinion of the Boston MPO.
Yes.
Okay. I'm okay with that. Thanks.
So is there a motion?
Daniel?
Daniel Amstutz, I will make that motion, and I don't know if this needs to be part of the motion to approve this. I guess to caveat, to flesh it out as Anne was talking about in terms of what constitutes progress as part of defining out how we would go about taking a project or putting a project back into the universe if there is no progress. So that can be part of the motion or just sort of like a direction going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Let's use that as direction so as to not confuse it. But Ann, you do have to flesh this out for us, okay? Is there a second?
Tom?
I'll second that motion, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Please call the roll, Jonathan. Unless there's further discussion. I'm sorry. Is there further discussion?
Len?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in light of our vote on the motion that we don't program any major infrastructure projects beyond the second ban, and the discussion earlier about how it kind of implies that we are committing to these projects. And Ann's comment about how it seems like when we've had people come in and talk with us, there has been movement. It almost seems like this is moot, but I just ask this in case I'm missing something. So I ask that to you, Mr. Chair, or to Ann. Thank you.
Well, I guess the fact that you're only going to be programming them in the first two time bands, kind of, we're going to assume that projects are moving forward more so than if they were out in the, the last time band. It's more of just an idea or a concept. So it may be moot, but there may be a project that comes in and then all of a sudden there's been a big design, the project, the public's against the project and it gets stalled out.
Right. I would also say for both Brian and Daniel's comments on this, there is certainly the possibility that the MPO will define progress differently if you're in the first band than if you're in the second band, right? Ann's point of you're holding you're holding a public process to define a project better. That probably, we all agree, is progress if you're 7 years out. If you're, if we're in a time band where you're supposed to be ready to be programming the tip, the fact that you're holding a bunch of project meetings might not be enough for the MPO to say that's progress. So I think this is one of those things that will be developed over time. Again, to Daniel's point, if we have to flesh this out. But the policy and the concept is, once we put you in the LRTP, you need to try to keep moving your project forward, I think. If that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Other questions or other discussion on this? We do have a motion on the floor.
David Kozes?
Yeah, just a quick question for Anne or someone. Can we think of examples where we've taken projects out of the plan due to lack of progress, even without this without this policy in place. I mean, of course we could. I'm just not sure if we ever have.
No, we haven't that I can remember. We did, it was for, when our funding got cut. We basically cut half the projects out back in 2009, but that was for funding purposes.
Okay.
Any other questions or discussion?
I believe Tom has his hand up to vote, but I do want to double check. Tom?
That was for the motion.
Okay, just making sure. Thanks, Tom.
Yep.
Excellent.
Samantha?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, just one note that I know that there's condition of some of the larger federal discretionary grant programs is that a project be in the LRTP, which might be a reason why something is in but not making progress. So, I can imagine if let's say we wanted some very large transformative project that we didn't have resources for, but we wanted to go after a federal grant, and that process might take many years. That could potentially be a reason why something is potentially in the out years and not making progress, just as a potential, I don't know, scenario or case study where that might be real.
That probably would be non-target funds.
True. Yep, that's a good point.
All right, any more discussion on this?
Seeing none.
Call the roll, Jonathan.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Romano, Samantha Silverberg, can we unmute Samantha?
Thank
John?
you. Yes.
Do we have John Romano in the list as well?
He is here, perhaps having an issue with the unmuting.
I thought I voted, sorry, yes.
Yes, okay. Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
Sorry, David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page,
Sheila Page, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Skinner, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now, just for the sake of Robert's rules, I need a motion that combines all of this into one motion. You don't have to restate it. We all know what it is, so that we can make sure that there's a vote on all of it. So can I get a motion in a second to adopt as decided on these previous series of motions, please?
Brian Kane.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Is there a second?
Eric.
Eric Barassa, I second that.
Call the roll, Jonathan.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Romano, John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
Thank you. Samantha Silverberg.
Yes.
Laura Gilmore.
Yes.
Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane.
Yes.
Leonard Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kansas.
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Yes.
Dave Monty.
Yes.
David Kozis.
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Dana Amstutz, yes.
Sheila Page.
Sheila Page, yes.
Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Siganowitz.
Austin Siganowitz, yes.
Patrick Keyser.
Patrick Keyser, yes.
Darlene Wynn.
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Jennifer Constable.
Jennifer Constable, yes.
And Tom O'Rourke.
Yes.
Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Ann, I'd like to say thank you to you and everybody else who worked on this. Really good job with a very difficult subject.
Thank you. It's one less thing we have to do as we get closer to the plan.
Thank goodness. I unfortunately have to leave. I have a conflict, and Eric is going to take the chair because we do have some other items we need to get done today. So Eric, can you take over? And thank you very much. See you guys in a couple of weeks. Sorry about this.
Yes, thank you. Okay. What is the next thing? On the-
Community
Bring up the-
Connections Program Review.
Oh, great. So Sandy, do you want to present on the Community Connections memo?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Community Connections Program, or CC as I'll be referring to it, is, I'll remind you, the MPO's funding program for first and last mile solutions, community transportation, and other small and non-traditional transportation projects, such as those that update transit technology or improve bicycle and pedestrian facilities. It's funded at $2 million per year in the TIP currently, with congestion mitigation to air quality, or CMAQ funds, to which are attached the conditions that projects must be new and must show a requirement, an improvement in air quality, among others. This is the first of several new funding programs the MPO will be developing in coming years, according to the Lrtp Destination 2040. The goal of today's presentation is to review for the MPO lessons learned from the pilot round of this program, which was conducted during federal fiscal year 2020 for funding that will be allocated during FFY 2021, and to gain the MPO's approval for changes to the program structure to reflect lessons learned. I'll take questions at the end, as well as asking for MPO's approval of the proposed changes. This is not an action item and does not require a formal vote. Staff are seeking the MPO's guidance in developing the application and scoring procedures for the coming funding round. I'd like to draw your attention to the memorandum accompanying this presentation, which covers the same content in greater details, and that is posted on the meeting calendar. Next slide, please. So just want to recap briefly the projects that are currently programmed through the Community Connections program. And these were the products of the pilot round. As you see, the program funds 5 projects in fiscal year 2021. One of those projects, the Newton Microtransit project, has requested funding for 3 years. Additionally, there are a couple of projects that have been scored and approved by the board for funding in future years, but not yet formally programmed in the TIP. In fact, none of the projects are formally programmed beyond fiscal year 2021 in the TIP, because they will have to come back to us and show a recurring air quality benefit. Next slide, please. Okay. So we conducted a brief anonymized survey of project proponents who applied for funding in the Community Connections pilot round. All respondents stated that the Community Connections application was a reasonable amount of work and asked for a reasonable amount of information. Additionally, they gave us some feedback, such as that we should consider whether the capital and operating categorization of projects is functional, consider a greater diversity of categories for applications, that there should be better communication once the project application has been submitted, and that there should be more transparency about how scoring works and how decisions are made. We also conducted a staff survey, which you can find the results of in the appendix of the memorandum. Just briefly, staff's overall impression of the program was positive, and they rated the extent to which the CC program and the project program in the pilot round fulfilled the MPO's goals as 8.5 out of 10 on average. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the details, I just want to highlight the major elements of the recommendations I'll be introducing for MPO discussion today. We'll go through each of these in turn. We're going to talk about updating the Community Connections program structure, taking advantage of MAPC's collective purchasing program, and revising project categories. We're going to talk about limiting revisions to the application, and then how to revise the scoring and evaluation processes. So one of the challenges in the pilot round was figuring out exactly which capital projects it's possible to fund while operating at the scale of the Community Connections funding, and also minimizing MassDOT's administrative burden in implementing these projects. What we learned is that it's challenging to fund the types of projects that the MPO had originally envisioned for this Community Connections program: sidewalks, trails, intersection improvements. Anything involving large amounts of construction is both a cost and an administrative challenge. So staff's recommendation is to pivot to using the Community Connections funds for a variety of smaller categories of projects. MAPC's collective purchasing framework is available to MPO member municipalities and is already approved for federal procurement. It can't buy every item that many municipalities might want, but staff have been working with MAPC to determine what elements appropriate for the Community Connections mission can be procured through MAPC's existing contracts. We've landed on 3, which you can see on the slide: bicycle parking, automatic vehicle location systems, and parking payment systems that we believe we can do for the federal fiscal year 2022, the coming funding round, and then a few that are listed under possible future items that might be possible to tackle in the future. Next slide, please. So you can see here in this table the evolution in project categories that we are proposing, along with the identified administrative path for implementation, because we do know that implementation has been an issue. So you've got the current categories from the pilot round on the left, the proposed categories in the middle, and then the identified path to administering the proposed categories in the right-hand column. But that's actually not all. Next slide, please. So while the details are not yet finalized, and we're not sure we're going to have these categories in place for the FFY 2022 funding round, since the application would ideally be going out toward the end of October, we are working with the MBTA to look into the possibility of funding bus lanes and e-ink countdown and information signs at bus stops through the CC program. These categories are possible because they further work already underway by the T in pilot form, meaning there's already a potential path to implementation, likely by the MBTA and with the involvement of MAPC's collective purchasing program down the line as well. We look forward to jointly updating you more on these categories in the future, including potentially expanding in future rounds to installations of other types of real-time signs. One of the important elements of reviewing the CC program was to evaluate how the scoring criteria performed. There was some discussion of this when we presented the list of projects to be scored to the MPO in February. Staff also conducted an in-depth internal review of the results of the scoring of the pilot round and of the criteria. As you'll remember, the CC criteria have 30 points for general criteria that are applied to all projects, and then 30 points for type-specific criteria that are either capital or operating, depending on the projects. This slide shows the top-level results of the staff review, and again, more details are available in the memorandum. Essentially, the wide variety of projects that we expect to apply to this CC program means that dividing the program into capital and operating projects is too binary and rigid. Additionally, in the pilot round, transit operating projects scored much better than the capital projects. In the review, we found that the capital-specific criteria had been written with the assumption that they applied to projects like sidewalk extensions, which, as I mentioned before, are likely not going to be feasible through the CC program going forward. The transit criteria, meanwhile, award points for elements that are already required by federal guidance, which is something that we'd like to avoid. So the core recommendation that we're making with regard to scoring is to score all projects on comparable criteria, eliminating differential scoring for capital and operating projects. The following slides will explain how that works. Our proposal is to eliminate the type-specific criteria and focus scoring on what are currently known as the general criteria. These are the criteria that really get to the heart of what the MPO is trying to accomplish with the CC program: forging connections, incentivizing cooperation between entities, equity, and closing gaps. Relying more fully on these criteria, which would otherwise be unmodified for this round, allows us to score a wide variety of projects in directly comparable ways while eliminating scoring disparities between different points. This recommendation would also normalize CC criteria to the 100-point scale like the new TIP criteria. We would reserve 10 points to score the proponents' budget worksheets, ensuring rigorous budgeting and financial analysis. And this is just a table showing how the points currently awarded to the general criteria would be scaled up to a 100-point scale. That we are proposing that the proportions would remain the same, at least for the coming round. All right. So while staff are not recommending modifications to the general criteria themselves for the coming funding round, there are a couple items that we wanted to put on your radar in terms of tackling in the future. First is fully aligning the CC criteria with the newly revised TIP criteria, which you approved earlier this morning. We had general agreement among staff that it would be a good idea to work on that after the MPO and staff have gained a year of experience with the new TIP criteria, which would indicate that we would tackle that next year. One of the elements that might play into the work of aligning the new TIP criteria and the CC criteria is the probable availability of new tools for what we call access-based scoring. Basically a software program that allows small-scale modelings of improvements in access to jobs and housing from infrastructure or transit service improvements. We've explored this possibility a little through our technical assistance contract with Transportation for America and the State Smart Transportation Institute, and we'll be working with MassDOT in the coming year to familiarize staff with a tool that MassDOT has communicated that they expect to license. We anticipate this type of modeling may be very useful for scoring small-scale projects like CC projects, but have not yet had a chance to explore it sufficiently. All right. And then we just have a timeline for next steps after today, assuming that the MPO is all right with the revisions that are provided here. In October or early November, we will release the Community Connections application for the coming round, and then the projects will be approved with the coming TIP in January or February of 2021. All right, so I'm happy to take questions at this time. Given the time, I'm also happy to take them by phone or email later, but I want to would just ask the MPO to give your sense of approval or disapproval or suggestions for what I've laid out here. And thank you.
Okay, I think I see Daniel Amstitz's hand raised.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Sandy, for the presentation. I'll make my comment and then I'll need to leave, but or I'll listen to the response and I need to leave. But I'm a bit disappointed that on the bicycle and pedestrian improvements, moving that towards just bike supportive infrastructure, and I don't see a clear sort of direction towards pedestrian improvements. When it comes to connections, I would think that crossings and crosswalks, and in particular, I'm thinking about things like pedestrian signals would be important, or is that something that was considered? Because these certainly, I'm thinking a little selfishly, but we have certain, parts of town that would certainly benefit from things like rapid flashing beacons or pedestrian signals that are not full signals, but they tend to be a bit expensive, like $20,000, $50,000 or so, which you could put in a number of different locations and sort of increase the cost of that. But was that something that was looked at, or was that too small scale? Like,
no, that's definitely not too small scale. That's a great question. The short answer is that it is the kind of thing we'd like to be able to do through the program, but at the current time, it's simply there's an administrative burden on doing such small projects. Anytime you're touching going into the ground, that becomes a major challenge. So even putting a signal or signage. And we're going to be working with our partners at MAPC and MassDOT to try and figure out how to make that possible in the future. But it does not seem like it's something that would be easy to do with the scale of funding and projects that we're talking about through the CC program at this moment, unfortunately.
Okay, I appreciate that. I guess I when I look at, bike supportive and we talk about things like bike racks, that's also, I mean, that's putting things to the ground, maybe a little bit different, but that's similarly kind of can be considered fairly small scale. So, but I understand that, there's already the NAPC procurement that makes that easier to do. But thank you very much. Yes, I think exploring that would be a great idea.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. How about Ken Miller?
Thank you, Eric. Just a couple of points. One, I don't know, Sandy, I don't know. I presume that we have, meaning Federal Highway has reviewed the previous solicitation and what you have, you're thinking about moving forward. Just to remind folks that unless the funding is actually transferred is an FTA transfer to an eligible recipient, like the T or a transit or a regional transit authority, these will be Federal Highway authorizations, and recipients have to conform to all federal requirements, Buy America, Davis-Bacon, all the kind of stuff that has to be all the kind of stuff that has to be in a federal contract if they're being direct recipients of this funding. Because Massachusetts does not have what's called a local highway program, meaning that MassDOT generally does construct all the construction with federal highway funds, and so just need to be clear that I think an announcement will be helpful to make sure candidate recipients understand that. Also, we have a question about, for those projects that require construction, I noticed that MassDOT, you have MassDOT OTP as the administrative path, and that's perfectly fine. However, we would suggest or request that there be a mechanism, whether it's the district offices or somehow that the construction gets inspected and signed off. There's a mechanism to get that done. And then finally, we are generally disinclined to approve capital for a transit operating service, like a new shuttle service, something that we are disinclined to buy rolling stock for a service that may only be eligible, may only be in service for 1 year, and then you have to, what do you do with that vehicle that you bought for a service that was only operational for 1 year? So we would strongly encourage folks that are considering applying for shuttle services or transit operating services to either contract for service or lease a vehicle or something like that, so we don't have the issue of what to do is getting rid of the vehicle and returning the money to the federal government and all that kind of stuff that would be required. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. And we're certainly working with our partners at MassDOT to produce, and at the T to produce guides for project proponents for how the implementation works this coming year. And I think our guidance for our application for the program actually already states that we won't fund vehicle procurement, since you did give us the same advice last year.
Good. Thank you, Sandy. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Ken. How about Tom Katzis now?
Yeah, I don't have much to say other than I'd inclined to follow Sandy's recommendations. As Sandy pointed out, for folks who are newer to the MPO, it's always been a challenge to try to get a low cost projects pass through, and something like avoiding construction actually makes sense, because it's just, and I'll just leave it like that. So I'd be inclined to support Sandy with what he's suggesting in general terms or specific ones. we're trying to figure this thing out and go forward. I mean, what in the old days, what we used to have was, and it still had to go through highway approval, but without something like the old enhancement projects that specifically set out something that could be done in a different way. What Ken's point is how I understand it right now. So, which suggests that we focus on things that don't get dug in the ground, more or less.
Okay, thank you, Tom. How about Laura Gilmore?
Hi there, just following on Daniel's comment and a bit on Ken's, I was just curious if, based on the feedback you've received, if you've thought about whether it would be helpful to set a minimum funding requirement, since it seemed like it was coming up that some projects may be too small to be worth the administrative burden here.
Yeah, that's a good question. We've talked both about having a minimum and a maximum. And the short answer is that we, at this point, staff basically feel we need a larger sample size to determine that. We don't know what the, what projects we're going to be getting applications for. So
Okay.
it's possible we'll come back to you in the future. But also, I think the administrative paths that we've identified at this point kind of ease things enough that having projects on the smaller size wouldn't necessarily create a huge burden. But I think you can expect to hear more from us later.
Yeah, so it sounds like at this point it's more focused on making sure that applicants are aware of the process that they would need to go to and the requirements that they would need to conform to.
Yeah, exactly. And the project can get through the process in a reasonable amount of time,
right,
because we have funding available, this coming year, rather than being programmed 5 years out as a normal TIP project would be.
Okay. Ken, did you want to make another point?
Thank you, Eric. Just to Tom's point, I guess maybe I wasn't clear. We are actually quite supportive of capital projects, construction projects. It's just that we want to make sure that, because frankly, if you run a shuttle service, you operate it for a year or two, you spend a lot of money, and then
it's gone.
It may not be beneficial, and then you have nothing to show for it. Whereas if you build bus shelters or buy bike racks or build sidewalks, that benefit is there for years and years and years. And so we actually are supportive of capital projects. We just want to make sure that when a capital project is done, somebody is keeping an eye on the construction and making sure that it's done appropriately. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ken, for that clarification. Tom, did you want to have another?
Yeah, no, thanks for clarifying that, Ken, but I'm just compelled to say I agree with you. I don't think I explained myself too well. It has nothing to do with what you guys want. It just has to do with the cost of things. And as people said, the cost effectiveness of it. But yeah, no doubt about it, Ken. And your point is well taken. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Are there any other, okay, I guess I see Len Dickens.
Quick question, Sandy. I'm going to have a lot more to talk about with you by phone. When it comes to the CMAQ analysis, I mean, are these projects so small that they'll even move the needle or even register at all? I mean, I'm just kind of interested in how that's assessed. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Ben Mueller, if you want to jump in here, or Derek Schuster, I don't know if he's here. But yeah, MassDOT maintains a set of CMAQ spreadsheets that covers some of the project categories. And some of the smaller types of projects, the CMAQ guidance states that they can basically be considered that they can be assumed to have an air quality benefit, and you just give kind of a written statement of why you would expect that. The answer is, the spreadsheets, the analysis will need to show with the CMAQ consultation committee a benefit, but these are small scale projects, and you're right that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see a transformative improvement in air quality.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, Sandy. Are there any other questions about Sandy's presentation? Okay, I think I don't see any. Matt Archer, let me know if I'm wrong.
I am seeing none.
Okay, seeing none. So let's go to the last item on the agenda, member items. Are there any members items? I'm not seeing any. I will use this opportunity to just make another plug about the MPO municipal elections. As Tegan said at the beginning of the meeting, the nominations are due October 16th. That information is on the MPO website. The nomination process is much easier this year. It's an online process. Please contact me if you have any questions about the MPO elections, the MPO process. Happy to help anybody. You can also contact Brian Kane as well as MEPC and the MBT Advisory Board oversee the process. So I just wanted to remind people about that. So if there are not any other items, I'd like to have a motion to adjourn. Tom Bent
I'll make that motion.
and Thatcher Keyser.
I will second that motion.
Great. Okay, we're not going to do a roll call without objection unless I see someone raise their hand with objection. We will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everyone, for a great meeting. This was a really great conversation today. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.